Good morning.
Good morning.
So, it's been a great week so far. There we go. Now I can hear myself again. I was playing with my volume knobs and couldn't hear myself anymore. So, yeah, we're already in Second Samuel chapter 8. We've gone live who knows how many times now. Um, but yeah, how has your week been?
Well, I look outside and it's beautiful. So that's a good thing.
Eye of the beholder right there.
It's right. What, uh, we have like 6 inches of snow. So it's
Yeah.
beautiful.
If it could stay off the roads, it'd be better, but,
I mean, it
you
pretty
know.
much is.
Yeah,
So wish be
just,
granted.
yeah. And then, what was it? I ended up taking Courtney to work today. So, one, so I could clean out the car, and two, because they don't ever actually plow their parking lot.
All right.
And so it's just like chunked ice with
Oh,
salt
jeez.
over it. So it's wet ice, just,
Mm-hmm.
and you know the parking lot, it's like sloped where on the
Yeah.
side that she parks at.
Yep.
So I'm like, you know what? I'll just take you to work today. And I backed down the drive, dropped her off right by the doors. So
Gotcha.
it's good. Um, so anyway, welcome. If you're joining, feel free to join the conversation by leaving a comment, uh, so we can talk about it. Um, and as you see, we've got Julie with us, my mother-in-law, because Jesse's at a funeral, which he's not happy about because funerals suck and nobody likes
Right.
funerals. Um, so pray for Brock and his family because it's his dad's funeral that Jesse's at. So and just keep them in your prayers. Um, but you watched last week's stream, right?
Yes. That was a long time ago. Wait a minute. No, I did not. I kind of did because I was getting out of the doctor
Gotcha.
when
Okay.
yeah. So I was kind of watching it and listening.
Okay. Well, I was gonna ask you your thoughts on the last chapter since Jesse always puts me on the spot
Right.
with
And
this.
geez, gee, Tony, no. um. Yeah, I couldn't give you a definite
Okay.
thought. Um.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, like, we were talking about like the heart David had and his desire to build a house for God because in his mind it wasn't right for the king of Israel to live in a house, but the
Right.
God of Israel to dwell in a tent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so his heart for that, and then God's like, "You think you can bless me? No, I'm gonna bless you." And then um, goes on and tells him like, "Hey, you're not gonna build me a house, but your son will, because David was a man of war
Right.
and had shed blood, which would mean anything he builds for the for the temple would have been uh, tainted by the blood of the that people shed just based on
Right.
readings out of like Leviticus and Deuteronomy. So,
Mm-hmm.
but anyway, getting into this because chapter 7 talked about David having peace on both sides or on all sides, and then we go straight into chapter 8 where it's talking about David going to war. And there's a couple different thoughts on this. One, this is either following how the Jews typically uh, did their writings, where they'd summarize something and then they'd retell it like two other ways.
Right.
Um,
I gotta tell you, some things I wonder if, you know, wasn't written by Donald Trump because of that.
yeah. Um, and so, like, when it says that David had peace on all sides, the best thought that I've seen, and I kind of agree with, is it was saying that, like, David's reign ended up with peace on all sides.
Mm-hmm.
And then this tells how he got to that point, which makes sense in a way because this kind of describes like the more of like what David did at the beginning, because chapter 7 says that where'd it go, that he made a name for himself, and that when he returned to Jerusalem he had made a name for himself. And then this shows like his conquest of liberating Israel from the Philistines and then bringing about a peace on all sides and
Mm-hmm.
making a name for himself. So, getting into it, chapter 8, verse 1. After this, it came to pass that David attacked the Philistines and subdued them. And David took Metheg Ammah from the hand of the Philistines. Then he defeated Moab. Forcing them down to the ground, he measured them off with a line. With 2 lines, he measured off those to be put to death, and with 1 full line, those he kept alive. So the Moabites became David's servants and brought tribute. Now, this is not an easy thing to
Right.
hear for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And like what it's saying is that David essentially took a yardstick or a measuring stick. He made the people lay down, and then he's like, okay, for these 2 sticks worth of people, you're going to be executed. But then the next stick worth of people, I'm going to spare you and you're going to serve me.
Right.
Uh,
This is,
and
I mean, this is key, you know, with people um, going against God, you know, and saying, you know, oh, he's just mean and, you know, and everything. And, you know, this throws right into that. You know what I mean?
yeah, and there's a couple different thoughts as to why David treated the Moabites the way he did. Because if we look at David's lineage, like he had I think it was like great great grandmother who was a Moabite. Who the heck is calling me right now? 517 number. I'll just silence that. There we go. So he had Ruth was his like great great grandmother who was a Moabite.
Right.
And for those of you who don't know the history of the Moabites, they like Moab, I believe, was the descendant of Lot's relation with one of his daughters. And they ended up becoming a burden and a curse to Israel because of what Lot and one of his daughters did and the child that came from it. And so, like David, one, his great great grandmother was a Moabite. And then in First Samuel we read that David actually let his parents live with the Moabites, and he entrusted the Moabites to protect his parents while Saul was on the rampage. And then we see this like extreme turnaround where David's no longer like, okay, I'm going to show you mercy, even though he does show some mercy by not wiping them all out.
Mm-hmm.
And no one knows for sure why, but it's thought that they must have done something either blatantly against God's people or against David or even against God to warrant what David did, because David, knowing the heart of David, he doesn't just randomly execute people.
Right.
He was someone who upheld justice and true justice, as we'll read later on. And so one of the thoughts is maybe the Moabites ended up killing his parents, kind of thing. Like,
Mm.
but we don't know for sure. But David spares a third of them, kills 2/3 of them, And then that third he spares becomes his servants, and they bring tribute. And this is talking about like an annual like gift to the king. And so Dave, picking up in verse 3, David also defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, as he went to recover his territory at the river Euphrates. David took from him 1,000 chariots, 700 horsemen, and 20,000 foot soldiers. That's a lot. Like,
That's a
that's a
lot.
major victory.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a lot to put in your pocket to take home.
right? Uh, I'm sure he was over encumbered by that, uh, but yeah, like he took from him those, and then it says that David hamstrung all the chariot horses, except he spared enough of them for 100 chariots. Which I had to look up exactly what it meant. But it just meant that he cut the hamstring
Right.
on the horses, so then they were no longer viable for war.
Kind of made him worthless.
Yeah. So, I mean, you ask anyone who races horses, like, horse gets an injury, it's no longer race worthy.
Right. If you've ever pulled your hamstring, you understand what cutting it would do.
Yeah. And so this is like David having this great military mindset of I won't kill your animals. Hold on. Apparently I hit the panic button. All sorts of things are going. There we go. So yeah, anyway, David was familiar with war and was familiar with strategy. And so he goes and he takes all these things from them, and then he cuts the hamstring on the horses, so then they won't be any good. So verse 5, when the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David killed 22,000 of the Syrians. Then David put garrisons in Syria of Damascus, and the Syrians became David's servants and brought tribute. So the Lord preserved David wherever he went. And David took the shields of gold that had belonged to the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. Also from Betah and from Berothai, cities of Hadadezer, King David took a large amount of bronze. Now, do you happen to know what David ends up using these metals for?
Well, I'm kind of guessing the big old building that's going to be built.
Yeah, and so even though David doesn't get to build the temple, him going with the Lord and the Lord going with him ends up providing for the temple that his son would build.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and so even like when you have a promise from God for future generations, he can still use you to provide for the fulfillment of that promise.
Well, I think, it's important to remember that with your children, I mean, he gives you children and, there's a promise, and then, but you have to do your job, you know what I mean? As a parent, raising them up and teaching them right, So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And like, imagine if Saul had used the effort that he had towards David towards actually doing what he was supposed to do, like driving back the Philistines and everything. Because we don't see that David was afraid of these armies and cowering in tents and stuff. We see that he goes out and he knows the Lord is with him.
Right.
And because he does that, he ends up providing for like the building of the temple
Mm-hmm.
and providing for the promise that David had been made. So picking up in verse 9, when Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated all the army of Hadadezer, uh, then Toi sent Joram, his son, to King David to greet him and bless him, because he had fought against Hadadezer and defeated him, for Hadadezer had been at war with Toi. And Joram brought with him articles of silver, articles of gold, articles of bronze. King David also dedicated these to the Lord, along with the silver and gold that he had dedicated from all the nations which he subdued, from Syria, from Moab, from the people of Ammon, from the Philistines, from Amalek, from the spoil of Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah. Now, notice the heart of David here,
Mm-hmm.
how he could have taken this and been like, this is now the king's treasury
Right.
and part of the wealth of the nation, but instead it says he dedicated it to the Lord.
That's right.
And so David was not a greedy person, which he then passes on to his son, Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
Because when Solomon builds the temple and sacrifices a ton of animals, the Lord visits him in a dream and he's like, hey, what you want? And this is my paraphrase, of course. And Solomon goes, I want wisdom to rule these people because I'm like a child going in and out. And the Lord's like, okay, since you asked for wisdom and not for gold, silver, and peace, I'm going to give you wisdom and gold, silver, and peace.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see that model that David gave to Solomon of, no, this stuff belongs to the Lord, get wisdom, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And it's repeated in Solomon. And so I guess this chapter is more about legacy than anything.
Sounds good.
Be-
I think it's pretty cool because, whenever David defeated somebody and, he took the spoils and he dedicated them to God, that's a good example for us. We go through, stinking situations, and when we finally have breakthrough and defeat the enemy, we need to, set up an altar, so to speak, and, dedicate the spoils to God and say, hey, you helped me through this, Um, I mean, David knew he couldn't do anything without God. He couldn't defeat these people without God. So, he knew where his strength came from. So,
yeah, definitely. And it reminds me of, I want to say Proverbs, the acknowledge the Lord in all your ways and he will
mhm.
direct your paths. I'm pretty sure I just butchered that. But like, it's that same sentiment that everything David did, he acknowledged God in.
Mhm.
God wasn't an afterthought to him. It wasn't, oh God, I'll just give you my 10%, or I'll just give you one day out of the week. Everything David did, he involved the Lord in.
Right.
And I think that's part of what it truly means to be after God's own heart.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
then everything you do, you're trying to involve the Lord in.
Yeah.
And not like Saul, where it's like, oh, I'm afraid we're going to lose this battle, so now I'll go to the Lord. David's like, I don't even want to think about going into battle without consulting the Lord.
Mhm.
And so we see that David went and picking up in verse 13, and David made himself a name, and he returned from killing 18,000 Syrians in the Valley of Salt. And First Chronicles records it as Edomites as well. And when you're the king, the military victories of the people under you get attributed to you. Because some people will point this out, be like, well, First Chronicles says it's Edomites, and it was Abiathar or whatever that won the victories, or Joab that won the victories, or Ehud. Like, they'll say that, oh, it says elsewhere that someone else did it, but here it says David did it. So who really did it? And it's the same thing like in our modern political system, that, like, let's take Trump's first term, for example, not to get too political. But even though he never went and fought overseas, it's still attributed to him that there were no new wars under his presidency.
Right.
And when we have leadership, it's the victories get attributed to the leadership, even if they're not the ones on the front lines.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not a contradiction from First Chronicles to Second Samuel. It's just a different perspective. Just felt like I should say that. And so it says he also put garrisons in Edom, picking up in verse 14. Throughout all Edom he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants. And the Lord preserved David wherever he went. And that's the second time it said that the Lord preserved David wherever he went. Like, it makes you wonder how often we decide not to do something because we're afraid or we're fearful, and not believing that the Lord will preserve us where we go. Because here it doesn't say that David specifically was like, okay, Lord, should I go here? And then he got specific direction to go. But it says that the Lord preserved him wherever he went.
Mm-hmm.
And him putting garrisons throughout all the areas, establishing his reign, establishing his kingdom, so then he can take tribute from that area. And David can do what he's done in the past, which is protect the people in that area. A lot of people like to contribute this kind of warfare to Rome, but David did it first.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, even when David, I forgot the guy's name, but when David was protecting the guy's flocks and stuff, and he sends his detachment to him and like, hey, can you give us something for protecting your flocks? It's that same principle that David may not have even thought to do that had he not already done it.
Right. Was that Abigail's husband?
Yes. I forget his name. I just know it means
Yep.
fool. So David not just was a tactically brilliant person, but he was politically brilliant as well. Because we see that David then sets up a leadership structure, picking up in verse 15. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered judgment and justice to all his people. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, the son of Elihud, was recorder. Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, were the priests. Sariah was the scribe. Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were chief ministers. And so we see this more complex form of a monarchy in Israel,
Mm-hmm.
that because David wasn't consumed with a jealous rage, he was able to actually organize a structure, and the Lord was able to bless it. Versus like Saul, where everything went to him, and he took on everything, and was so power hungry that the slightest threat to his kingdom he wanted to eliminate, even if it was his own people.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So yeah, anything else you want to add to our discussion today?
As I was reading this earlier, I wrote down God doesn't love David more than us. If we give God the glory for our victories, we can win his favor and continue blessings.
Amen. And it also reminds me that, like, last Friday evening, we had a Shabbat service with Rabbi
Mm-hmm.
Sean. And tonight we're watching Why Stand with Israel. And the common theme between both of those is that we as Gentiles, or we as people from the nations, have been grafted into the family of God, have
Mm-hmm.
been grafted into the Jewish olive tree. And what that what you can take from that is that the promises that were made to Israel in the Old Testament, those promises were made to that family. And we've been grafted into that family, which means those same promises are also for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why the why the Old Testament should not be ignored or should not be scared, because there are blessings in the Old Testament that are attached to obedience. And like we see this with David, the blessing he has is because of his obedience. Because when Moses gives the law, he says, I set before you blessing and cursing, life and death, choose this day. And he says, choose life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I often wonder if maybe some of the troubles we go through as Christians, if maybe it's not persecution, or maybe it's not like demonic oppression, it's just us not walking in the statutes of God.
Mm. It's a good thought.
And so maybe we're not seeing the blessing of God. And
Mm-hmm.
this is not saying that, like, oh, you sow $100, you're gonna get 1,000 back. I'm not saying that
You're
at all,
right.
because we're not talking about like the prosperity gospel. We're talking about the actual promises of God, that He will bless the work of your hands, that um, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the earth. Like those promises that are hinged on obedience. Like like maybe just maybe those old covenant promises, those Old Testament promises that were made to Israel are also applicable to you because you've been grafted into the family of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Right. One
And
thing we study with the kids, the promises in the Bible, and the kids all know that there are 8,810 promises in the Bible. Ask, Judah or Jesus, they know that, and it's pretty cool to, reiterate that none of them will not come true. They'll all, all these promises are yes and amen, you know.
yeah, and that's good. Like I did not know the number, if we're being
Yes,
honest. But
8,810.
so yeah, that is a lot of promises, and we
Yeah,
see David walking in some of those promises
right.
where he keeps God first and he walks in the statutes of God, and he's given peace on all sides, as we read last week. And he has this victory where, or these multiple victories where Israel gets blessed. And we as Christians have been grafted into that family, and so we can receive that same blessing.
Mm-hmm.
Why does it seem like we always get the short chapters when it's
I
just the two of
know,
us?
right? Oh, the next one's short too, so
Yeah. Okay.
it was
Well,
good.
yes, definitely good. And next week we get to see David's kindness and him honoring his promise to Jonathan. So
Mm-hmm.
that'll be good stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
otherwise, if you are in the Hartford, Michigan area, we are screening a movie tonight called Why Stand with Israel. You are more than welcome to join us. And that's tonight being Friday, the 22nd of November.
We'll have
Uh,
popcorn.
yes, gonna have popcorn. It's gonna be a good time. There's a lot of information that's gonna be given, and it's shown in a great way. Um, yeah, it's gonna be a good time. So thank you for joining us, for listening to me ramble. So I don't get to do that very often. So yeah, have a great day. God bless, and we'll see you next time.